And that's kind of what Buds is. It's a grind. It's not any one day. There are days that suck more than others, but any one day is completely achievable for most people. But you layer 179 more of those, and that's what makes the difference. It hurts. You have issues with your body for a couple of months afterwards. Shin splints are very normal. Hip flexor issues. I know guys who had bald spots on their head for a couple of years afterwards from running with those boats on their heads. And I wish I could say the career was less painful as you went farther into it, but it's not. I mean, most guys at the end of a career have knee, hip, shoulder, and neck issues from carrying a lot of weight often, uneven terrain. But to get back to the training aspect of it, it was a grind. It's a meat grinder for sure, and it's designed to be that way because you're selecting for a particular type of individual that looks at that adversity like motivation, not as a stumbling block. And it works. I mean, the people that I worked with were some of the most amazing human beings that I've ever encountered on earth.
Do you feel like, and this is probably a difficult question to answer, as far as, the mental, how hard it taxes you mentally versus physically, is there one that you would say was more difficult? Like, do you have to be more mentally strong or, because physically, if you both.
Yeah, you got to have both. Obviously, but the thing is, if you can make it to the first day of SEAL training, you physiologically possess what it takes to graduate because you've done so many physical screening tests. They have a pre-training program, so you're doing running and swimming and pull-up and all the stuff you're going to do in the training program. So physiologically, there is, of course, a component for that, but it's mentally where most people will crack.
Was there one specific that you can recall, or a combination or a day that was specifically challenging, or something, a task that you had to do that really kind of, for you personally, was just something you really had to dig down deep and to kind of overcome?
I would say for most people, the cold is the great equalizer. Just being close to hypothermic for hours on hours on hours, and then getting warm and just starting to see like the sunshine at the end of the rainbow, and the instructor's like, yeah, let's go back in the water. It's just always looming over the top of your head. So that is probably the most difficult mental task in that 6 months, is just the consistent uncomfortableness and just the crushing cold from the Pacific Ocean.
So what ways did you sort of, because again, you talk about the cold and all that stuff and dealing with it and how mentally taxing it is. How did you learn to like deal with it or cope with those situations where, again, one day is one day, but then you're in there for 180? How did you deal with each one of those days separately?
I got advice from people who had been successful, who were farther in training than I was. And I kind of learned it a little bit when I was working for my dad. And I think we talked about it a little bit when you were on my podcast, eating a whale a bite at a time.
Yeah.
My dad worked in masonry construction. So when I was really young, I'd go to the job site and I didn't have any actual technical ability when it came to building stuff. So I moved things around for those who were building stuff. And God, I remember to these days, pallets of brick, they show up in 500, these just huge squares of 500 bricks. And I had brick tongs that could carry 6 at a time. And when I first started working with them, it was like 2 hands on one tong to move those things along. And then it became 1 hand on each tong, so I'm moving 12 bricks at a time. And there were job sites where I'd roll in there in the morning and there'd be 15, 20 pallets of bricks.
Oh, wow.
And my dad would say, yeah, why don't you go ahead and move these bricks from here to there and spread them around. And I learned early and even my dad, he was like, don't focus on how many pallets of brick there are left. Just pick up a tong of brick and just keep doing that. And, before you know it, lunch is going to be here. And before you know it, the end of the day is going to be here. And that's the genesis of what I used going into Buds. Instead of thinking it as 180 days, I would just try to make it through the day. See the sunrise tomorrow, and then we'll make our decision on whether or not we want to keep going. And if that doesn't work, chunk it down even deeper. You could go from breakfast to lunch. You know what? I'm going to make it to lunch today. Regardless of what happens, regardless of how much this sucks, I'm going to ignore that and just make it to lunch. And we'll make our decision from there. And it really helps take a lot of the weight. I mean, you look at 180 days. When you start any 180-day process, if all you can focus on is the distance from where you are to where you're going to be, good luck being successful. Not that you can't be successful, but the odds are not in your favor. I mean, it's not that hard to make it to the end of a day or to make it to lunch. So it really was the reduction of the task into something that I could focus on and ignore everything else. And you can play that game with yourself on any goal, whether it's personal or business or financial or weight loss. And there's no right or wrong answer for the chunk. Some people can tolerate bigger ones. And when you're first starting, maybe start on the smaller side of the house and build that momentum. And it makes a difference in people's lives, or it has in mine at least.
And you call that keeping the world small, right? Like making your world smaller.
Yep.
Yeah. Because for you guys listening, if you haven't listened to it yet, I was on his podcast a couple of months ago. And when I was out there, we were talking about that idea that I had heard you say before. And, that's it's such simple advice. Like, it's something we know we need to do. And it was something I had to kind of, for me, because there's all kinds of different stuff going on all the time. And it was something I had to sort of regrip onto, because that's a good idea. So it became like one of the, in my office, I have like a bunch of little index cards with like quotes or mantras or things like that. And that was one of the ones I got pinned up there. I was like, that's a good one to keep. That's a writer downer to have up.